Over the past couple of years on this YouTube channel, I've read and summarized over 100 books. And I'll be the first to admit that during that time, especially in the very beginning, I made a heck of a lot of mistakes. See, I started out with a lot of preconceived ideas about reading that I feel like really hindered my progress, and it's likely that you have those same preconceived ideas. Inside of this video, I'm going to help you bring awareness to each of those ideas, and we'll talk about how we might move past them in order to increase your reading efficiency and retention. If you're interested in getting access to all 100 plus book summaries, dozens of different tools, and 600 plus ideas organized into this AI-like web, you can click the first link down below in the description. I've pulled out the 20% of the best books on personal development that I think will help you speed up your process in reading. The first idea here that I pulled out, and the first really mistake that I think a lot of us are making when it comes to reading, is reading something that you hate. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration potentially, but the way that I first came across this in a way that just made a ton of sense to me was inside of Sonke Aaron's book, How to Take Smart Notes. They profile Nicholas Luhmann, who was one of the most prolific publishers of his day. And one of the things that really stood out to me was Luhmann has been quoted as saying that he never did anything he wasn't excited about. I'll actually go in and show you kind of what that looks like here. He said, I never forced myself to do anything I don't like. He said, whenever I'm stuck, I do something else. And I think that's something that really, for me, was not the way that I went about reading when I first got started. I would get a recommendation from a friend or someone I trusted, and I would essentially follow that recommendation from page number one all the way to the very end of that book. And this caused me, honestly, to essentially stop reading for long periods. And that's actually kind of going into what we're talking about reading from first to last. But the thing I would say here is do your very best to read things that you're excited about, to read things you're interested in, and to put down things you're not interested in. It's easier said than done though, because we're told from a really early age that we need to study subjects, we need to work on projects, and we need to take tests about things that we're honestly just not that interested in. And for some reason, that kind of makes us feel like we have to go into certain subjects, we have to learn certain things that maybe aren't actually that interesting to us. That causes us to take long breaks from reading, and honestly, it just makes us read not as much as we might if we were focusing on things that we were actually excited about. Now, point number two, or mistake number two that I made, and that likely you're making as well, is reading books from first page to last page. And this is something that I did constantly. And like I said, it stopped me from reading for really large chunks of time, even months at a time sometimes. I wouldn't even pick up a book when I first got started trying to read about a book a week. See, when you pick up a book, the thing that I think we need to keep in mind, and it's super counterintuitive because of the things that we're taught from a very early age, is that you do not need to read that from front to back. It is not mandatory. And connected directly to that last idea, I think often a book is only exciting in certain parts or certain ideas of the book or the things that we're actually interested in. And when we think we need to read linearly, it's really easy to get stuck in uninteresting or unimportant parts to us, which can cause us to honestly just stop reading entirely or even just read a little bit less than we might. Because a lot of us have a second kind of belief built into this reading first from last is like, if I didn't finish my last book, I can't start a new one. And I would bust that one as well. I have multiple different books on the go at any one time. And I think that that is one of the best ways to do your reading because like Luhmann said, you can kind of hop back and forth to the interesting and important pieces for you rather than having to kind of focus on things that are uninteresting. Another antidote to this idea of reading from first to last to me is to cultivate the idea and the practice of the 80-20 principle. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is coming from the book, The 80-20 Principle by Richard Koch. And he says that the 80-20 principle, like the truth, can make you free. You can work less, and at the same time, you can earn more and enjoy more. The only price that you need to pay is some serious 80-20 thinking. So we'll go back into this one as well. The 80-20 principle, the whole idea is that the 80-20 principle is everywhere. And it requires kind of practice, and it requires us to spot the few really important things that are happening in order to ignore the mass unimportant things. It teaches us to see the wood from the trees. And the principle is coming from someone called Wilfred Pareto, an Italian economist who studied wealth and income distribution in the 19th century. During his studies, he realized that the majority of the land and the wealth was controlled by the minority of the individuals. In fact, he said, 80% of the wealth was owned by 20% of the people. And it turns out that this 20% of people owning 80% of the X is actually happening in a lot of different areas. Crime, accidents, things like that, marriages, carpets, and traffic. And I believe that it really applies to our reading as well. 20% of the book that you're reading is likely holding 80% of the information that you truly need. And I think that's something important for us to keep in mind. The way that this shows up for me is I personally think that the table of contents is the most densely packed, most important piece of the entire book. That is always that's in the 20% of the 20%, the top 1% for me. So that's where I start. I always start with the table of contents. And what I do is, if I have a physical book, I will mark it. I'll say this chapter is interesting, this chapter is interesting, and this chapter is interesting. And I will start with maybe 3 or 4 chapters, depending on how long the book is. And those are the chapters that I'll visit first. If I go to one of those chapters and I feel like I don't quite understand because the book was written a little bit linear and I don't quite understand, then I'll go back and try and find the information until I understand in order to go to the important pieces of the book. So you don't need to read from first to last. The table of contents is your friend when most people skip it. I would say that reading the first chapter and the last chapter front to back is probably a good use of your time, especially when you're first getting started. And then reading a couple of chapters and seeing if you can understand what they're trying to say is probably your next step. If you want to take it all the way to kind of the highest level, for me, is what I do is I read the first chapter, the last chapter, obviously the table of contents first. I read the first paragraph and the last paragraph of every chapter, and then I decide which chapters to dive into a little bit more. So that's maybe a more advanced way of doing the 80-20 principle, because you get a good idea of kind of what the argument is and then the closing argument, as long as the book is written in the way that most normal books are. So that's kind of the 80-20 principle in my reading, and that's how it shows up for me. The next mistake that I made was thinking that one book has all of the answers. And I think this is easy to do because books are amazing. Authors sometimes are pouring their entire lives into them, and we can read and digest that knowledge in just hours. That's why, of course, we're all here. Books are important, they're amazing, but it's very easy, I think, to think that books have all of the answers. And the truth is that they don't. The situation that you're in is unique. The information you're seeking is likely multifaceted, multidisciplined, and one book, most often, is not going to have all of the answers. Instead, I like to think of reading as creating a web. One that if I consult it, either in my mind or inside of this amazing tool that I've created, it might give me some insight into the problem, into the situation, the project that I'm thinking on. And the way that I think about reading is really like a preparation. Leonardo da Vinci thought in a much similar way. And inside of his book, Michael Gelb, How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci, he gives us 7 different principles, but the 7th principle is the one that stands out the most to me here. He says that a recognition and appreciation for the connectedness of all things and phenomena. This is the systems thinking. And really what we're doing here while we're creating a web, taking notes, and reading is creating a system of thinking for ourselves. And I think that's the way that we should be viewing our reading, as a preparation for things that might come next. Decision, situation, projects. It's not very often that you come up with a particular problem and you are maybe thinking, okay, I need to do research on this, because in today's fast moving world, you have to make decisions relatively quickly. So it's important to be building a web, to be building a system, to be preparing ahead of time with your reading rather than trying to read up to the moment. The next piece is kind of directly connected to that, and this is probably one of the most common, one of the hardest to identify mistakes, and that's that thinking reading is helpful in and of itself. There's a ton of literature out there on adult learning, and I really recommend that you check out some of the books that I've done on learning. You're thinking about Make It Stick. You're thinking about A Mind for Numbers by Barbara Oakley. Really great books on adult learning. And most of it, and most of those books, is pointing to the fact that just reading, just listening, or just watching to new information isn't enough to make a lasting connection. In fact, it's pretty fleeting. Instead, we need to implement methods in our reading process to tie the knot. So you can think of this as like almost adding an additional step on your reading process so that we can actually benefit from the information. And the idea of tie the knot is actually coming from this idea of cranberries from Make It Stick. And it goes like this: a child stringing cranberries on a thread goes to hang them on the tree, only to find that they've slipped off the other end. Without the knot, there's no making a string. Without the knot, there's no necklace. There's no beaded purse, no magnificent tapestry. Retrieval ties the knot for memory. Repeated retrieval snugs it up and adds a loop to make it fast. Today, we know from empirical research that practicing retrieval makes learning stick far better than re-exposure to the original material does. This is the testing effect, also known as the retrieval practice effect. To be most effective, retrieval has to be repeated again and again in spaced out sessions so that recall, rather than becoming mindless recitation, requires some cognitive effort. They call this desirable difficulty in a lot of the other books as well. Repeated recall appears to help memory consolidate into a cohesive representation in the brain and to strengthen and multiply the neural roots by which the knowledge can later be retrieved. So this is kind of what we're thinking about here is, what's this extra step that I can essentially add into my reading process so that the knowledge doesn't go in one ear and out the other? And I think retrieval is a big piece of that. I also think kind of like moving from theory to practice is maybe what it looks like more in a less academic sense, where you're taking the information you're learning and making something from it. You're moving from theory to practice. And if you're interested in figuring out what this might look like and how I'm using this to essentially build this YouTube business and also make myself smarter along the way, I really recommend you check out the video that I did on how to take smart notes by Sonke Ahrens. Really great ideas around creating a system for you to take notes and then to be able to essentially use the recall that we talked about inside of Make It Stick and Cranberries, tying that knot, use that recall to essentially build something meaningful out of it, which is this system for me, and it might be something different for you. The final piece that I wanted to touch on that I think is so important is thinking that the map is the territory. And I really struggled with putting this one in the video because I'm not sure if this can be resolved without actually bumping up against its effect in the real world. But the idea from Shane here, Shane Parrish, the map is not the territory. Let's talk a little bit about this here. Even the best maps are imperfect. That's because they're reductions of what they represent. If a map were to represent the territory with perfect fidelity, it would no longer be a reduction and thus would no longer be useful to us. A map can also be a snapshot of a point in time, representing something that no longer exists. This is important to keep in mind as we think through problems and make better decisions. 4 key points. A map may have a structure similar or dissimilar to the structure of the territory. 2. Two similar structures have similar logical characteristics. If a correct map shows Dresden as between Paris and Warsaw, a similar relation is found in the actual territory. 3. A map is not the actual territory. The London Underground does not convey what it's like to be standing in front of the Covent Garden station, nor would you use it to navigate out of the station. 4. An ideal map would contain a map of the map, the map of the map of the map, and the map of the map of the map, etc., endlessly. We may call this characteristic self-reflexiveness. Imagine an overly complicated guide to Paris on a trip to France, and then having to purchase another book that was the guide to Paris, and so on. Ideally, you'd never have any issues, but eventually the level of detail would be overwhelming. When we mistake the map for reality, we start to think that we have all the answers. We create static rules or policies that deal with the map but forget that we exist in a constantly changing world. When we close off or ignore feedback loops, we don't see the terrain that has changed, and we dramatically reduce our ability to adapt to a changing environment. Reality is messy and complicated, so our tendency to simplify it is definitely understandable. But it's something that we need to think about when we're reading books as well. I mean, the authors have written the book with a very specific audience in mind. They've got a very specific time, or they've written it at a very specific time with a very specific problem in mind. And the fact is that you don't fit into all of those categories. This book was not written specifically for you, and it's not possible to get a book that was written specifically for you, unless maybe you read it yourself. But this is something that we visited several times throughout the video here today. A single book does not have all the answers, and reading not being helpful in and of itself is something that we also touched on. But one key takeaway I want for all of you is that even though the map isn't the territory, you are the adventurer. You are the one that is in the territory. And honestly, it's a heck of a lot easier to have a map, books, down here in the territory. We just want to make sure that we're not confused, that we don't think that this book is speaking specifically to our situation and solving all of our problems, because it's not. You're going to have to combine multiple different ideas as well as your own personal experience to make any decision or to solve any problem or to get out of any situation. So that's why I think the map is not the territory is so important to keep in mind. Now, this is 5 reading mistakes that you're probably making. If you liked this video, give me a thumbs up and let me know. If you're interested in more mistakes that you might be making on reading, maybe something a little bit more practical, leave me a comment down below. And as always, if you're interested in getting full access to my personal development AI, the 20% of the 80% of the books that I've read, all organized into a super easy to use AI system that's going to recommend you different books, recommend you different ideas. You can click the first link down below in the description to get access to that, or you can click join on the YouTube channel. Thanks for being with me here today, and I do recommend that you go and check out some of the videos that I've referenced inside of this one.